Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, did you want to say something? I'm Joshua Moritz. I'm a philosopher at the University of San Francisco. That's my day job. And I work with Ted and Bob in the Journal of Theology and Science at CTNS. And my background's in evolutionary biology, and my project in this overall project, my specific project, was to look at the question of evil. We've already broached the topic of theodicy, and so I'm going to talk about it a little bit more specifically and ask, what does the central role of chance in evolution have to do with the problem of evil, especially contingency? And we can look at this a couple different ways. Of course, I won't go in a lot of detail in 15 minutes, but one, what is the place of chance in evolution? That's one question I'm asking in my paper that was contributed to this conference. And secondly, what purposes might God have in creating through evolution? Is it worth it? So the first is a scientific question. The second is a question of value, right? So we can talk about Darwin's own views. He wrote that chance is essentially ignorance. You can see in a letter to Asa Gray, he thinks of designed laws as responsible for evolution with the details worked out to chance. But of course, Darwin didn't mean chance as pure chance or probabilistic chance. He meant chance as ignorance. We can talk about other views of evolution, neutral theory, where chance is involved in molecular mutation to a very high degree, natural selection. And we can talk about the history of life, well known as Stephen Jay Gould's famous focus on contingency. He said that if we were to rewind the tape of life and play it again, right? Imagine life's evolution. We rewind the tape and we play it again, but every time, let's say it has a different beginning, would we ever get the same thing twice? Stephen Jay Gould says, absolutely not. What are the chances that an asteroid would hit 65 million years ago to destroy the dinosaurs and give us mammals a chance to proliferate and expand and complexify? Never happen again, right? Not if you were to rewind it 1,000,000 times. And so there's nothing inherently predictable about evolution. It's inherently unpredictable. And that is really the high point of the focus of contingency in evolutionary theory. Notice this is 1989. Well, what's happened since then? It's no longer 1989. We have a couple decades of research and work. So I'm going to talk about some of that work in a very summary fashion. One is developmental constraints in evolution. Developmental biologist Scott Gilbert, in his book Ecological Developmental Biology, talks about the modern synthesis having a gap in explanation. He puts it this way, that natural selection can explain the survival of the fittest, but not the arrival of the fittest. For that, you need developmental biology. So developmental biologists, known as evolutionary developmental biologists, or Evo-Devo is the word of choice, have stressed the directedness of evolutionary processes based on something called developmental constraints. And these constraints have to do with using the same molecular toolkit. Very early on, we get certain genetic complexes that are conserved throughout all of life. Will this exist in the same way on another planet? Well, as long as these other planets have the same molecules, some would say there's a good chance, but this is an open question. But it's interesting, some of the conclusions that some of these evolutionary developmental biologists and developmental biologists have come to, several have said that developmental mechanisms per se constrain variation in non-random ways. And so notice that there's this language of constraint in non-random ways. Even if mutations or other genomic changes might occur at random, developmental processes constrain such genetic chance events in ways, they say, that will determine how random gene changes can be expressed in the phenotype. So even with random mutations, development is doing its own thing. And you have this theme. That's one area. Another area is, what about experiments where we do rerun the tape of evolution? And we could say, well, is there anything that happens again and again and again that we wouldn't expect, given the values predicted by pure chance? And we find a number of these. Actually, if you do a search for Stephen Jay Gould and Convergence, or in the area of parallel evolution, There's something like 20,000 studies in the last 10 years published in scientific journals. A lot of material out there. I've gotten a chance to look through several hundred of these, each which specifies that Gould has been refuted, right? So they go out of their way to say Stephen Jay Gould and his 1989 prediction is wrong. Here's one with the hammerhead ribozyme. They say our results show that despite the dominance of contingency or historical accident in some recent discussions of evolutionary mechanisms, they cite Gould on that, purely chemical constraints can lead to the repeated evolution of the same macromolecular structures. This is just one study of literally hundreds out there saying the same thing about Gould. So what explains this? That's the big question. But we can look at molecules, we can look at genes, we can look at things like the camera eye. This is an example that Simon Conway Morris, who's an evolutionary biologist at Cambridge, talks about. He says you have the development of what's called the camera eye at least 7 different times independently in evolutionary history. We can look, for example, at the squid and the mammals, and their last common ancestors up here, 580 million years ago. You can see that they're pretty far separated. Right? This is the Cambrian. This is about as far back as you can go for complex organisms. And did their common ancestor have a camera eye? The answer is no. So why do you get the same anatomy, the same use of proteins and such? Right? That's the question of what role do laws of nature play in biology? Are these emergent systems? It seems like they are. Where are the constraints? That's the big question that I think is an open question. Simon Conway Morris has written on organizational templates, perhaps out there in Platonic space. There could be other explanations as well. This doesn't necessarily need to be contrary to natural selection. Some have read it this way, but I think they work together. We can think about air as an example, right? There's only so many ways you can fly, so we have the convergence of wing types, and that seems pretty straightforward in terms of selection. But then we can think about body types. Well, maybe there's only so many niches you can occupy. Maybe if you're a Jurassic ichthyosaur, where there's a reconstruction there, if you thought that was a dolphin, it is not a dolphin. Or a dolphin which is there, and you think, well, what is their common ancestor? There's a reconstruction, right? A proto-lizard in the Triassic. So you think, okay, well, these look nothing like a proto-lizard, but there's a niche to be occupied. You have convergence of type. And how far can we take this? We can look at marsupials, which are, kangaroos, opossums, things like that, and the mammals, to which we belong, the placental mammals. And you have 2 different, what look like wolves. One's a gray wolf. One is not a gray wolf. That's a marsupial wolf, the Tasmanian wolf. And you can think, okay, well, there's a lot of convergence in body type, in habitat, but one is more closely related to a wombat, and one is more closely related to a giraffe, right? So this is convergence. Why are we seeing these same types over and over again? Perhaps it has to do with pure natural selection. Perhaps there's something else going on. We can look at the same thing in saber-toothed cats. We find that the same sort of things are happening all over the place. We see this in flying squirrels, mice, moles, anteaters, all throughout mammals, other places. The point is, this is ubiquitous. Again, you can think of a common ancestor with the mammals, think something like something that looks nothing like either of these saber-toothed cats, because if you were to look at their genes, you find one would be closer to an elephant, one closer to an opossum. And that's just to give you the point of convergence. Why do you get this converging of form, converging of types at every level we can think of? George McGee, who writes a book called On Convergence with the Vienna series of theoretical science or theoretical biology called Convergent Evolution, limited forms most beautiful. Darwin said unlimited forms most beautiful. But now it seems like there are limits. He says, well, the idea of Gould, that the evolutionary process is non-repeating, is demonstrably false. He believes it has been falsified. The view that evolution is entirely historically contingent and thus unpredictable and non-repeating is demonstrably false. Right? So what is the role of contingency in evolution? It doesn't seem to play as strong a role or as large a role as it used to, even to the point of some folks talking about developing a periodic table of life. based on things like the Fibonacci sequence is everywhere. Every plant you look at has their leaf development. It's called phenotaxis, according to the Fibonacci sequence. Right? We have it in our own bodies. It seems to be everywhere. Fractals are everywhere. What role do these play? Can we think of something like a periodic table of life? That's the goal for a lot of these folks. So Simon Conway Morris, who works on this, says the roads of evolution are well defined, and evolution can go only in very few directions. The contingencies of biological history will make no long-term difference in the outcome. So he's taking this conclusion, but we do have contingency, but there seems to be constraint in the contingency. In light of convergence, he says if we rewound the tape of life and played it back again, we would probably get a very similar story. Something like humans, though not quite, right? I think of convergence to a certain type. That language, I think, is consistent with this. So how does this relate to evolution? We can think about what are God's goals in creation? Well, if creation isn't entirely contingent, it seems like there could be goals. Maybe that can happen through quantum indeterminism and mutations, maybe self-organizing principles, maybe higher laws, organizational templates. I think that's an open question, but we can think more theologically, philosophically. What are God's goals in creation? And I would take this from a Judeo-Christian understanding of God, that God wants creatures who are free and who can have relationship, right? Personal, loving relationship, love being a big focus, right? Loving relationship with God. We can think what's needed for loving relationship with God? Well, rationality, knowledge, independence. We can think of an example of, I have a friend who's a robotic expert at Carnegie Mellon, works with the top robotics labs in the U.S. Navy, and he's been a long-time bachelor, and I imagine, well, one day, what if he introduced me to this individual here and said, this is my new wife, and she's programmed. This is a Geminoid F, right? This is a robotic intelligence. You can see videos if you look her up on YouTube. It's very interesting, right? I programmed her to have all the same likes, dislikes, music tastes, right? All the same values as me. And am I to congratulate him on his relationship? Is that relationship of the same value as a relationship where the person is not hardwired for love, right? That's the question of freedom. Is it a value we want? Is it a value God wants? Alvin Plantinga has written a lot on this, a philosopher of religion who writes on the free will defense, argues a world with free creatures is more valuable than one without free creatures. So how does indeterminacy work into this, right? What's the place of randomness in this? Well, Nancy Murphy, who's here, and Tom Tracy and others have argued that for many of these values, we need a law-like world. We need a world that's predictable, a world that we can make rational sense of. So that seems to be necessary for freedom. But we also need, and this is Keith Ward quoted here, indeterminism for radical freedom. So you need some sort of balance. And you can ask, well, is that the balance we have? It seems that randomness, in terms of indeterminism, is related to freedom in a very important way. And freedom is required for relationship. We can think about why. Well, think about a romantic relationship. You want to be loved for yourself, not for who your parents are or for how much you make or your position. Right? We can think about God in the same way. Well, God, this is Keith Ward arguing this, desires independent beings who can love God for God's self and who can be loved, who want to be loved for their own sakes. The more self-created we are, the more it is right to say that God loves us for who we are as opposed to loving us for what he has made us into. So we can think about this world and ask, what is the role of evolution here? Can we see it as a positive value? I argue that we can, because evolution is a process, the only process we know of, where creatures are self-made to a very high degree. Right? So if we think about what happens in evolution, creation is created to be creative and to a large degree create itself, but within the bounds of freedom and constraints. Right? Not absolute freedom, but also not absolute constraint. Through designing evolution as the mechanism of creation, God made creation to create itself. This is Basil of Caesarea who says this. God says, let the earth make, let the earth produce. What does the producing? The earth, says Basil, if you read Genesis literally, right? And so that's perhaps not what modern literalists would read into that, but Basil of Caesarea did. Because in an evolutionary scenario, creatures are more independent, they are more free. The increase of creaturely freedom is a general trend witnessed throughout the evolution of life. These are just bullet points that I try to make more explicit in my paper, and we'll argue for it at a deeper level, but just giving you a sense of where I'm going with this. The divine goals of creaturely freedom, independence, rationality, knowledge, morality appear to necessitate a certain degree of physical indeterminism in order to come to fruition. Indeterminism as it's intermixed with law. If you have lawfulness plus indeterminism plus evolution, this seems to be, I would argue, the most fruitful way for God to accomplish God's goals in creation. Thus, what I'm trying to do in a theodicy is give a positive value to evolution, to ask, why would God ever create through such a process? It seems that this process is tailor-made for God's purposes. But relationship requires eschatology, which is the key part. So this isn't only in this world, but there's a spectrum of free creatures for ultimate relationship, right? So this includes the world to come, the new creation. But this gives a purpose to this creation. Why not start with heaven? Well, the answer is because freedom, our particular type of freedom, seems to require this sort of process. So that's essentially where I'm going. I think I'm 1 minute over. So how about some questions? Yes, Jerry.
Moritz then suggests that if we had not had collision 63 million years ago, that it would have been through the dinosaur path.
Yes,
that we
yes.
would be here, and that we might not have hair, but sort of scales on us. Or something.
Yes, he would. Let's see. I wonder if I can actually find it here, but he would, and he would say, there it is. Right. That by the Oligocene, the Earth was finally leaving its greenhouse state and entering an ice age house world, culminating in the final Pleistocene ice age. This is commonly Moritz, right? So if they had lasted to the ice ages, they would have went extinct anyway. He would say they were just about 35 million years. The asteroid was 35 million years ahead of schedule. Thus, saying you need the whole timeline of the universe for us to get where we are as intelligent life. Conway Morris would say, if there's intelligent life out there, we're 35 million years ahead of schedule. Get there. So, which is an interesting take, right? Yeah. But he would say, plate tectonics gives you the inevitability of furry, fuzzy, relational creatures. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Would you say then that the energy of creation is the impulse towards always increasing complexity? And with increasing complexity, inevitably, towards the latter stages of that, you start getting self-reflective human consciousness.
Yeah, I would say certainly here, right? I think self-reflective consciousness, Conway Morris would argue, is part of that because we don't only see it in humans. We start seeing it in many different forms. You see it in all the other hominins who weren't humans. You see convergence of tool types that are created. You even see that in the New Caledonian crows who have technology, right? Tool types that have a specific evolution, intelligence. You see that in a number of different forms that aren't just primates.
So, I mean, complexity to the extent that an entity, a living entity, can relate to God.
Yes, and the question is, when do living entities start to relate to God? Which is development and evolution. When does a child start to relate to God? Right. If you look at some animal studies, you read a lot. Well, this is like the capacity of a 4-year-old child, human child. Right. So it's the same question in our own development as an evolution. I think the goal, I would argue, is for all creatures to relate to God in their own ways. And this is a spectrum of relationship. I think we're at the end of one side of that spectrum as far as we know. there could be others out there, and who knows about that. But where does that spectrum of freedom start? What we have in terms of available data seems to push freedom back further than we would have expected. Even there's some interesting experiments on fruit flies with very simple behaviors, but unpredictable behavior that's not explained either by pure randomness or by pure determinism. So so these are all open questions, but I think that's consistent with the idea of a spectrum of freedom. Yeah.
So the convergentists are saying that, in a sense, if I understand you correctly, that convergence seems to be inevitable. But what about complexity? Are they saying that complexity
Yes.
is inevitable? No, is there a direction to this?
Complexity seems to be a general evolutionary trend. And so can you talk about the convergence of complexity? I'm not sure. I haven't seen that discussion in convergence, but I would think yes, but that's a speculative yes. So, yeah, are we done?
Yeah, I think we got it. Thank you.